Hello, and a warm welcome to this series entitled Meeting Mark. Over the course of the next 5 sessions, I will take you on a short guided tour through Mark's Gospel. Mark is by far the shortest of the 4 New Testament Gospels, and it is possible to read Mark quite comfortably in a single sitting. You may like to do that for yourself. It's well worth giving it a try, as you are left with a real sense of movement and pace as Mark recounts the story of Jesus' life. Mark is relatively straightforward in style and language, though Mark's theological ability should certainly not be underestimated. Historically, it's attracted less attention from the great expositors of the early and medieval church, but nevertheless has had and continues to have a profound effect on all sorts of readers. In his book Meeting God in Mark, Rowan Williams gives 2 examples of great Christian 20th century theologians whose lives were impacted by an encounter with the Gospel of Mark. I'll read a section from Rowan Williams' book to give you a sense of the importance of the Gospel in these 2 great figures' lives. So Williams writes, "And yet Mark's Gospel still has for all sorts of readers an exceptional impact. 2 of the foremost Christian communicators of the 20th century, one of them happily still with us, have claimed that they owe their Christian faith simply to reading Mark without any particular preparation. The great German Protestant theologian Jürgen Moltmann was a prisoner of war in Scotland in 1945. He and his fellow prisoners had just been shown photographs of the horrors in the camps of Belsen and Buchenwald, and were dealing with the nightmare realization that they had been fighting for a regime responsible for unimaginable atrocity. Moltmann had little Christian background and no theological education, but when an army chaplain distributed copies of the Bible, this is what he said: I read Mark's Gospel as a whole and came to the story of the Passion. When I heard Jesus' death cry, my God, why have you forsaken me?" I felt growing within me the conviction, this is someone who understands you completely, who is with you in your cry to God, and has felt the same forsakenness you are living in now. I summoned up the courage to live again. A similar story is told by the late Metropolitan Anthony Bloom, who did so much to open up to Westerners the Russian Orthodox tradition of prayer. As a skeptical young man, he had been persuaded to attend a camp for young Russians, and attended an address by a celebrated and very saintly Orthodox theologian. The address infuriated and disgusted him, and he went home determined to confirm for himself the emptiness and stupidity of Christianity by reading the Gospels. He chose to start with Mark simply because it was the shortest. He says, "The feeling I had occurs sometimes when you are walking along in the street and suddenly you turn round because you feel someone is looking at you. While I was reading, before I reached the beginning of the 3rd chapter, I suddenly became aware that on the other side of my desk there was a presence. I realized immediately, if Christ is standing here alive, that means he is the risen Christ." He committed himself there and then to the Christian faith, and lived it out in a variety of costly ways for the next 70 years, bringing many other people to the acknowledgement of that same presence he had encountered. So I don't think we should ever underestimate the power of Mark's Gospel. Mark begins the Gospel with the verse, "The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God." Euangelion, the Greek word, good news. It's a shorthand that we use for the Christian story. More literally, it means a bit of good news. A bit like a press release announcing a significant event of public interest. A message which changes the climate in which people live, transforming the landscape. So the gospel is meant to be, as Mark indicates, an official proclamation about Jesus. And verse 1 makes it clear that it is about regime change. God is taking over. Mark's Gospel is then a book about change and new possibilities, not just a record of past events. It's different to what we understand by history and biography. Ancient biographies were built up of a series of anecdotes, looking at the subject from different viewpoints and in different situations. It was not overly concerned with chronology. It's better for us to see a gospel as a set of snapshots rather than a connected story. Much of Mark consists of pericopai, paragraphs of information that lead to a kind of punchline and reports of people's actions. So, for example, a story might begin, "So he said." The story is then told with the punchline, "And they were all amazed." So Mark isn't like a straight line historical retelling of the story of Jesus, but a weaving together of snapshots in order to build the picture of how Jesus was himself the proclaimer and the embodiment of good news. So who, where and when and why are questions for us to think about in this first session. According to early 2nd century tradition, Mark was the secretary of Peter. Bishop Papias, from that time, who quotes an earlier source, John the Presbyter, identified Mark as the author, Mark being a companion and interpreter of Peter. So Mark took down what Peter said, not in any particular order, but then interpreting it to make it accessible to new listeners and readers. Mark may have been from a well-to-do family, perhaps closely related to Barnabas, who was a wealthy merchant from Cyprus. The Gospel was written possibly in one of the great commercial centres in the year 66 to 70 AD. Rome is one possibility. Archbishop Rowan Williams goes for Jewish Roman North Africa. Some commentators, for example Williams again, argue for the 60s AD, before the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Others contend for a later date. Matthew and Luke, written around 85 AD, used Mark as a resource. So Mark was certainly written before them. The reason for Mark's Gospel? Well, Mark was written during a time of persecution. Peter and Paul had both been executed, and he was looking to encourage and instruct Christ's suffering and dying followers. Mark shows suffering to be part of the path of discipleship. Just take a look at Mark 8 verse 34 for instance. There was an urgency for an accurate account to be written. Jesus' followers were aging, and Mark was close to the events of Jesus' life, so there was an immediacy in Mark recording his Gospel. He sought to encourage people to make sense of suffering by keeping their eyes on Christ. Some characteristics of Mark's Gospel. One is something known as the messianic secret. Mark identifies Jesus as the Christ, the Messiah, in his first sentence, in that first verse of Mark's Gospel. He was writing for a Greek audience, hence he uses the word Christ rather than Messiah. And Mark notes Jesus' reaction. Mark 1 verse 34, we are told that the demons were silenced at Jesus' command. And elsewhere in the Gospels, humans are told not to spread the good news. This attempt to keep his miracles secret and his power over demons quiet is known as the Messianic secret. And the reason may be that many expected a warrior-like Messiah. The Romans would have been very wary of any claims to be this kind of Messiah. Mark recognized, however, that Jesus became the Christ through his resurrection, offering spiritual salvation to all. But certainly the Romans would not have looked kindly on any sense of someone putting themselves forward as Messiah. And that may be one of the reasons why Jesus told both the demons and humans not to mention the things that he was doing during the early stages of this gospel. Jesus is identified as the Son of God in the first line of his gospel. And this was demonstrated throughout the gospel by the miracles and the power over demons that Jesus exercised. But still the disciples struggled to understand Jesus and his message. The true meaning of discipleship was something stressed by Mark and a central theme of his gospel. Mark was close to the time of the disciples, and he identifies and reveals to them their human frailty. Jesus was sometimes frustrated, as we see in Mark, by the disciples missing the point of his message. And Mark was less sympathetic about the disciples than the later gospel writers. They all identify the disciples as struggling human beings, but they afford them a little more respect than Mark does. The true disciple follows Jesus' example, suffers and willingly accepts death for the sake of the kingdom. His disciples look not for glory, but for a cross in life. And bearing this in mind, Mark was writing for Christians suffering persecution in Rome. He was wrestling very much with how people were to follow Christ in the midst of suffering and persecution. When we come together next time for the first real session as we start working through the chapters of Mark, we'll be looking at chapters 1 through to chapter 3 verse 6. So if you're able to read those ahead of the next session, that would be helpful. If not, please have your Bible to hand, and we'll work through those on the next occasion. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you'll be with me for session 2. In the meantime, take care, stay safe, and God bless you.